Jag minns ju den tid du gav mig life billar, yo. Nu vill jag kunna ge tillbaka allt jag inte kunnat ge förut. Det finns ingen annan där som kan stå här by my side, oh why. Sättet du rör på det får mig att dö för det, baby. För de här yardis, de vill ju bara dra ner oss. Men du är fett och vanlig. Och det jag lägger all min tid och jag vill ha det. Du får mig känna safety. Jag kan nog leda, baby. Och jag kommer aldrig ändra mig. Aldrig.
Greetings, fanboy. How y'all doing?
What's up?
All is well here in the Berg. All is well.
All is good with me on the way to Florida.
Hey, man, what's that trip like? How long you been on the road so far?
Man, we've been on the road now about 3 hours.
Oh, yeah, y'all
3 hours.
So you going to Orlando, ain't it?
Yes, sir.
You about halfway there.
Yeah, because we in Pooler, Georgia.
Yeah, you about halfway there. It's about a 6-hour ride.
Yep, you right too, Gas. 6-hour ride.
Yeah, I know that road to Florida well. I'll be down there myself in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, man. So, Kimo, what's going on in Orangeburg, man? I seen you've been making some moves out there. We had a recent interview, and you've been checking out some events. What's going on?
Oh, man. Like you just said, yeah, there was a very powerful interview with the People Station, Hot 93.7 with Mr. Harvey Elwood. He blessed us and allowed us to speak on the radio station with him. I've been going to a couple of other events. I've been hanging out at the Historical Society, digging deep into the history and everything. So, and looking forward to the few events that's going to be coming up in Columbia and other places around here. Juneteenth, that's coming up in a couple of weeks. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, that's powerful, man. So you finally put your hands on them documents, huh?
Oh, man, I tell you, man, that is a surreal experience to actually touch the documents that the planners had. You know, names that I recognize, and it will also be family surnames that pertain to us, but it's more of the planner history. But it's cool anyway, because I was told by my cousin Bernice that at some point, you got to go and sit amongst the archives and let the ancestors talk to you and feel that spirit.
There you go.
That's what I did, and it was good. It was good. I really got a kick out of that.
Yeah, because all of that holds pieces of our history. So hey, we got to do the work. So that's great that you're doing that.
Yeah, man, for sure. So we have a great guest here today. Again, for our viewers, we're sorry about last week. We were supposed to be here. Technical difficulty. We're here this week. We're here this week, and we're here with a bombshell. I would like for Brother Dom to introduce our special guest today, because you recommended that we interview this brother, man. We look into the background. We understand why, but we want to give you the honor of bringing him on out.
Yes, it is a pleasure to introduce. I'm trying to introduce Mr. Greene, Professor Greene, Associate Professor Greene of History at Claflin University, man. He is I've been following his work now for about a year, and he has his own podcast, which escapes my name, but it's an interesting podcast nonetheless for everybody to check out. I think this is going to be another dope and great show, so let's get him on out here, man, and chop it up.
Oh, yeah, for sure. With no further ado, Brother Robert Greene. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for that great introduction, Dom. I really appreciate that. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, man.
Look, I had to make sure I got it right, man.
Well, and I will say the associate thing is relatively new. I just earned tenure about 2 weeks ago, so I'm pretty stoked about that.
Well deserved.
I think somebody's mic is carrying over some sound. Somebody's background is carrying some sound, but I'm clear. So Claflin University, huh?
Yes, yes. I have been at Claflin University since 2018, and it's been really an honor and a pleasure to work there for this long and to be really part of a strong HBCU tradition. I often tell my students and colleagues alike that being an HBCU is a really special endeavor. It's a really special experience. But I think there's something unique about working at an HBCU in a place like South Carolina, and especially in a city like Orangeburg, that, as we're going to discuss, has its own rich Black history.
That's powerful. That's very, very powerful. So where you from, brother? What's your background?
I am originally from Augusta, Georgia. I was actually born in Germany because my father was in the U.S. Army at the time. And I grew up in Augusta. I went to Georgia Southern University for my undergrad in actually creative writing. My minor was history. But I've had a lifelong love of history. I joke with friends of mine that the reason I am sitting before you today as a historian actually begins way back in 1991, when my father sat me down one day to watch the film Glory on VHS.
Oh, wow.
And my dad knew that I loved history. He knew that I was, even as a small boy, had a keen interest in history, especially African-American history. And he sent me down to watch Glory with me. And he told me, hey, son, this is really important for you to watch, to understand, to learn from. And ever since then, I have been deeply committed to studying history. So I got my MA in history from Georgia Southern, and then I moved to Columbia, South Carolina in 2012 to begin my PhD at the University of South Carolina, finished it there, and then began teaching at Claflin. And so that's a little bit about me, but I had to mention Glory because, of course, it ties to the state of South Carolina, it ties to Black history.
Yeah.
And I really thank my parents, my mom and dad, both for instilling in me a love of learning and a love of history.
Yeah, it sounds powerful, brother. It sounds very powerful. Coming from a military family background, of course. And then having that movie, that fight, you know, the depiction of that episode of the fight, be what motivated you into becoming a historian now that's educating our next generation of historians. But very, very powerful. So I commend you for that. Also, it sounds like you had the kind of father that was able to guide you in a way, like in a suggestive kind of way, expose you to information and let you process it for yourself. That's powerful.
Right. You know, my father was a really big fan of history as well. In fact, when I was growing up in Augusta, he would sometimes take me to a bookstore called Hamilton's, which was a Black-owned bookstore in Augusta, Georgia for many years. You know, he would sit me down and watch films about history. My mother was also really important in that she instilled in me a love of reading, of reading the newspaper daily. Our family, of course, like any good Black family, we got Ebony magazine every month. I grew up reading Jet magazine and at the barbershop, that sort of thing. But I really think that it's coming from that background, having parents who cared about education and being in an environment where other Black people were also saying, hey, please learn our history, please enrich our history. I think that made a big difference. And I think that kind of stuff makes a big difference for kids growing up today, too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, that's good. It sounds like my own family history a little bit. And I know you're a Claflin man, and my mother went to Claflin. My son graduated from Claflin. I've been around Claflin all my life. I've been around state all my life. And I wanted to tell you, because I know you specialize, I believe you specialize in the civil rights era.
Right. Yes. And the aftermath.
Well, I'll tell you this little story here because I'm a child of the 60s and everything. So I remember being on Claflin during those days. And just like you, my mother kept Ebony, Jet. She had books by Eldridge Cleaver. It was my mother who introduced me to Malcolm X and all that kind of stuff. And I remember being on Claflin as a little boy. I remember when the first Indian American family moved into our neighborhood and started actually teaching up on Claflin. So I've always been around Claflin. And then another thing I was going to mention, I remember my mother introducing me at the time, H. Brown came to the school. And I was a little fella.
Man.
And I got to shake his hand. And that's really about all I remember. But you know, my mother, she had all kind of, I guess, student activists used to come to our house, and I remember we used to be walking down Russell Street. I remember the bowling alley thing, and I remember the night the night my mother got a call. We had to, because they had a curfew back in Orangeburg during those days, and my mother had got a call. My Aunt Jean broke curfew, so we had to go rescue Aunt Jean. I don't know what she did, but I remember me and my mom had to go get Aunt Jean and bring her back home. But that's my Claflin civil rights, Black Power movement era. I just wanted to share with everybody.
Yeah, it's powerful. It's powerful. Hey, Kimo, even while you're saying that, brother, man, listen, we're still begging for the state to free H.Rap Brown, to free our brother Imam. You know, free him from the inside. Right now, they're saying that he has only a few months left of life. This is what the doctors are saying. And
I heard that as well.
The family is begging for mercy, man. His video is out with his son, like, come on, man, let him home. And, you know, so we can't forget those who fought for our freedom, especially when we're talking about educational freedom, especially when we're talking about those who were the first on those campuses, were the first integrating those universities and was putting their lives on the line so that, you know, our pathway to education would be open. We can never forget them. We can never turn our backs on them. And Orangeburg seems to be a center for education. Even when you look into some of the former slave owners, a lot of them were of educated class. A lot of them were scholars themselves and lawyers, people who worked either in Columbia or worked in Charleston, but preferred to live midway, somewhere in the Orangeburg district area. And so you already had a certain pedigree of European that was enslaving our ancestors that had a certain value on education. It seems like as soon as we were emancipated, it's education that we completely went into. And when you look at Orangeburg particularly, you look at the role of Claflin and state in that. Can you summarize what it would have been like for our people, in your opinion, during the Reconstruction era and post-Reconstruction era, that fight for our proper education?
No, that's a great question. And I think it's one that is important for Black folk to deal with even today, because we have to remember something very important before we really jump into Orangeburg specifically. Let's keep in mind that Black Americans were the only group of Americans who were specifically barred from learning how to read and write for a long time. Yeah. So right off the bat, in the age of emancipation and Reconstruction, Black people understood the intrinsic value of an education because it was barred to them for so long. You add to that the fact that during Reconstruction, this generation of Black men and women who are going from slavery to freedom, they know they have to be able to, for example, read contracts. They have to be able to sign their name to contracts to actually know what they're getting into. In fact, with Orangeburg, there's actually a wonderful letter you can find on the internet at various primary source websites. It's a letter written by a soldier with the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865, who is writing from Orangeburg back to Washington, D.C. And he's talking about what he's seeing on the ground with the formerly enslaved men and women in, I think it was July 1865. And he's saying, these formerly enslaved people, we're having to tell them that freedom comes with responsibility, freedom comes with certain obligations, etc. And then the response he gets from Washington, from, out of all people, General O.O. Howard, and later the guy from Howard University is named, he writes back and says, well, they understand what freedom is. Help them achieve that with education, And so Black people in Orangeburg already, like you just mentioned, understood the importance of education. This is where Claflin comes in, being founded in 1869. It's important, again, to put Claflin in context of other, what we now call historically Black colleges and universities. It was part of that first generation of HBCUs that was primarily founded by former abolitionists out of New England. So Claflin's named after two men named Claflin, one who was the governor of Massachusetts, the other one was a Methodist minister. They were trying to help Black people learn how to read and write, do arithmetic, things like that in the Orangeburg area. And then very quickly, Claflin, along with Fisk, with Shaw, with other Black universities at that time, Allen and Benedict and Columbia, they really come to the forefront of Black learning and education. And then you come to the 1890s and you have what's now SC State being formed in 1895, 96, where State was originally part of Claflin's campus. It was sort of the Mechanical and Agricultural Institute on Claflin's campus starting in 1872. By the 1890s, Southern state governments are doing two things at once. They're putting in place Jim Crow segregation in terms of voting rights, in terms of other social rights, but they are also accepting money from the federal government for land grant colleges. But the caveat is that if you're a Southern state, you have to have a land grant college for both your white citizens and your Black citizens. In South Carolina, the white land grant college, of course, is Clemson, and SC State became the Black land grant college. And so Orangeburg, having two HBCUs in it, really becomes an important place for Black education. And because of that, it also becomes an important place for Black activism, Black cultural output. You really cannot imagine the history of Black South Carolina, or really South Carolina at all, without thinking about Claflin and SC State both being in Orangeburg, both being smack dab right next to each other.
Right.
That's right.
Wow, that's great. And then I was learning about Voorhees and how even a Black woman is who started that college down in Aiken County. No, down in Bamberg County, I believe it is.
At that time, it was Barnwell.
Yeah.
Wasn't that Robert Smalls' daughter-in-law? Something along them lines, if I'm correct.
I think that sounds about right. I think you're correct about that.
Yeah. So it's powerful. We were just talking briefly before we went live about the love for local Orangeburg communities, like the Great Branch community that they have for education. Baba Kimo was explaining, like his mother, his uncles, aunties, everybody went to school there, and then they went on to college. They went on to State. They went on to Claflin, and they went on to have professional careers. A lot of them moved their families from the south to the north, chasing those jobs, chasing the upward mobility. And I want to see if Kimo, if you can chime in and add that component to this conversation, because you've really been doing the research on the Great Branch community and touching base with the institutions out there. How does communities like Great Branch tie into this educational environment in Orangeburg?
At the Rosenwald School, a lot of my aunts and family members, they all went to school out there, but they all eventually ended up going to State and Claflin. And then once they graduated from those two universities, they were part of the Great Migration. They were moving up north to Pennsylvania and New York. That's what my mother did. When my mother graduated in 1970, and I remember it clearly. Right after she graduated, she had to get up out of Orangeburg because there was nothing here. Everybody was recovering from the what was going on here at the time with the Orangeburg massacre and the civil rights era. They was in recovery mode. I can remember family members sitting around at the table talking about these events and everything. But one thing they did was they wasn't they wasn't scared people. They said they were more like, we was living a normal life, but they left it up to God. It was a spiritual kind of thing also. They left it up to God, man. But, we survived, and they went on to different places and lived their lives. That's what they did. Yeah. But I was going to ask Mr. Greene, because I believe he talks about this lady. Her name is Modjeska. I got her name here. Modjeska Simpkins. I know she was imported to the civil rights era here in South Carolina. She's a major teacher, and I believe you spoke on her before. So, I don't know much about her, so I'd like to hear from you on her.
So I often tell colleagues of mine in the historical profession that, if nothing else, South Carolina specializes in producing incredible men and women who are not very well known outside of our state, but should be. And I think Majeska Simpkins is a prime example of that. Now, full disclosure, I am also the lead instructor for the Majeska Simpkins School of Human Rights, which is sort of a freedom school run by the South Carolina Progressive Network. I've been doing that since 2019, where we actually deliver what we refer to as a people's history of South Carolina. And this is all really a tribute to Ms. Simpkins. Now, Majeska Simpkins from South Carolina, she went to Benedict College. She was very active in the state as both a civil and human rights activist. In fact, if you look at the civil rights history of South Carolina from the 1930s onward until her death in 1992, Ms. Simpkins is involved in some form or fashion, whether it's being part of the NAACP's leadership in the 30s and 40s, whether it's being part of the Southern Negro Youth Congress of the 1940s, whether it's being one of the first folks in the state to come out against the Vietnam War in the 60s. In fact, in the 70s and 80s, she was very active in the anti-apartheid movement, in the environmental justice movement. If there was a movement for freedom, Miss Simpkins was on the front lines in South Carolina. She was one of the first Black South Carolinians actually honored at the State House in Columbia with a portrait of herself, which is actually kind of funny because she spent virtually her entire life fighting against South Carolina state government. But Miss Simpkins is the kind of figure like Septima Clark, like Robert Smalls, so many others who don't get enough credit within the boundaries of South Carolina, and certainly aren't as well known outside the state as they should be. Miss Simpkins, I think, is example A in that kind of analysis.
Wow.
The way you explained her just now also reminds me of Esau Jenkins. Like, he's not widely as known as he should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
there's so many in South Carolina.
Yeah, well, Esau is a family member of ours. He's a Jameson. We well acquainted with Esau Jameson. Matter of fact, I'm going to be talking to one of his granddaughters here, or great granddaughters here soon. So maybe we can pour a little libation or something for Mr. Esau. But another thing I was going to ask you, I switch gears a little bit because I know you talk about Juneteenth. Why is it important for us to celebrate and recognize Juneteenth?
Well, I would argue there are at least two reasons for this. And first, I want to say apologies to our brothers and sisters in Texas, Oklahoma, who've been saying, we've been doing this for generations. You guys are just getting on the boat now. But I think there are two big reasons for it. Number one, in a national context, I think Juneteenth is very important because it is a bit odd to me that there is not a day on the calendar to recognize the end of slavery, the destruction of slavery, and the defeat of the Confederacy. If it were up to me, I would have a holiday in April about the end of the Civil War or something to say that, hey, we defeated the Confederacy, we destroyed slavery. But I think Juneteenth in some ways does that. But that takes me to my second point, why Juneteenth is important for Black Americans in particular. It's really important for us to recognize that while Juneteenth has its origins in Texas, as one of the last places to find out that slavery had ended, African Americans across the South always had their own holidays celebrating emancipation. Many Black communities, including in South Carolina and Georgia, had January 1st as Emancipation Day. That was, and in fact, Charleston has their Emancipation Day parades even now. And I think it's important for Black people to celebrate emancipation because it's critical for us to think about how far we've come, but also to recognize that while the Black experience in America is an American story, it is still a unique story within that larger context because our ancestors were enslaved, because they had to overcome slavery, segregation, and so forth. And I think Juneteenth is a wonderful and impactful way to do that. I would simply encourage folks, whether you're viewing this in South Carolina or across the country or around the world, that if you're celebrating Juneteenth, don't be afraid to add your own local unique flavor to that holiday. To say, by the way, Juneteenth means this, it comes out of Texas and Oklahoma, but we should, for example, if you're in South Carolina, say, by the way, we should also think about how emancipation looked in South Carolina versus how it looked in Georgia or Arkansas, Louisiana, or Texas. So I think Juneteenth is critically important because it, at least it's the one day on the calendar that forces Americans to remember, yes, we had slavery in America, and it took the bloodiest war in our history to actually end it.
Yeah, and to chime in on that, like, yeah, this over, if I could count over at least between 8 or 10 different emancipation days in the U.S. alone. So I'm glad you highlighted that, because, you know, even celebrate Juneteenth, you want to, you know, it's not just it deals with Texas and the other areas where people from Texas migrated, but also overall, it should make people think in their regional areas like, wow, we should start celebrating our emancipation as well.
Absolutely. And you know, even when we're saying this about, about Juneteenth, and we're talking about how it manifested differently in different parts for the enslaved Africans, and we're talking about Orangeburg. You know, as you guys know, I wrote a pamphlet last year highlighting my ancestor from Orangeburg who was liberated as a consequence of Sherman's march through the Carolinas. And his march started from Savannah on January 1st. But without the Union Army seizing Orangeburg and burning the town to the ground, there would have been no defeat of the Confederates. They had South Carolina entrenched. They had all of that. Like, that was where they lived at. Sherman even bragged and boasted about finally being able to torch the homes of David Flavel Jamison and William Gilmore Simms, and he wanted that, you know. And so, because he understood that the leadership of the Confederacy, the original leaders of this secession movement, were the same people who owned lands and our ancestors in what was known then as the Orangeburg District. That the Orangeburg District was the headquarters of the Confederates who initiated the Civil War. And that's very, very powerful. It's very, something we don't think about. But even as Orangeburg descendants, we don't say, damn, well, when was we free? And then even you, brother, you're from Augusta. Augusta was occupied until the Union Army left Orangeburg for Columbia. And then the Confederates left Augusta and pursued them to Columbia. Same thing happened with Charleston. Charleston was occupied until then. So I like the concept that we study the local history and we learn those particular details and teach those inside curriculum, inside the household and the classroom as a general open history to be proud of, because if anything that Juneteenth can do, it can take us back to the moment. We say the beginning of our freedom. Yeah.
No, I think you're totally right. And you also highlight a good point, which is, as someone who grew up in Georgia, the way we learn about Sherman's march is more about what happens in Atlanta and Savannah. And in my education growing up, it was, oh, Sherman burned down Atlanta, then he marched to Savannah and cut a swath of destruction. We never talked about him going into South Carolina. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because for folks in Sherman's army, the place they really wanted to destroy was actually South Carolina, because they held the Palmetto State responsible for the Civil War. And again, as we're talking about Orangeburg as a place and how important it is, if you see South Carolina as not only the intellectual heart of the Confederacy, but also in a lot of ways, the incubation center of white supremacy in America, then that makes Orangeburg especially important because of its midway point between Charleston and Columbia, because of the slave owners who were in Orangeburg, because of the place Orangeburg held within South Carolina. So then I'm glad you brought that up, because this really should encourage folks to think about Orangeburg in particular and South Carolina in general in really important and critical terms to not just the history of the South, but the whole history of America and the world.
Well, don't you think like Orangeburg gets left out of the conversation a lot? I mean, they kind of like forgot about us, man. They only look at us as being the Orangeburg massacre, and seems like we stuck right there. Believe me, I know what happened with the massacre, with the Orangeburg massacre and everything, but I think it's a little bit time to move beyond that. It seems right. I've been here for I moved back here about 20 years ago, and it's like stuck.
That is a really big problem, I think, in terms of how we think about Orangeburg and also Claflin and NC State, because all those histories, they seem to often begin and end in February 1968 when the Orangeburg massacre happened. And yet, as I often tell my students at Claflin, there was an Orangeburg movement for a decade plus before that, where students at Claflin State were working together to overturn segregation in Orangeburg. Also, I think to your point, if we're going to talk about the Orangeburg massacre, we should also be intentional about talking about its aftermath and how in the 70s and 80s, you still had a vibrant intellectual culture at Claflin State that had been shaped by the massacre and what happened in its aftermath. You know, you're absolutely right. We can't just talk about these things in terms of the massacre. And I would even add this. There is that problem. And then also there's the problem of we don't treat the massacre with the kind of attention it deserves. And what I mean by that is the Orangeburg Massacre as an event, because it took place in 1968, gets overshadowed by the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. But when it happened in February 68, it was national and international news that South Carolina state troopers and police officers shot and killed college students on their own college campus. Right. As an example of how big a deal this was, the Black left magazine Freedom Ways, which was published from 1961 to 1985, in its spring issue, which became a tribute to Dr. King after his assassination, in that issue, they have a whole page called In Memoriam to the Martyrs, and it has 8 names on it. 5 men who were executed in Rhodesia around that same time by the white supremacist government of Ian Smith, and then the 3 men who were killed in Orangeburg around that same time, saying that what happened in Rhodesia and what happened in Orangeburg were tied together. So even with the massacre itself, I think in some ways people think of it simply as a local story and that's it. But you can't talk about, say, Kent State or Jackson State in 1970 without talking about Orangeburg, nor can you talk about the fact that there's all this violence against civil rights and Black power advocates in the 60s throughout the South that in some ways culminates with the Orangeburg massacre. So there's a lot of work to be done around the massacre itself, but a lot more work to be done about the history of Orangeburg. And to that effect, real quick, I'll just say my colleague at Claflin, Dr. Catherine Adams, in our Department of Humanities, she is doing some incredible work assembling oral histories of folks in the Orangeburg area, both about the massacre and the larger legacy of civil rights in Orangeburg as well. So I want to shout out Catherine Adams and her work on that too.
Yeah, that's like what Dr. Greg Carr said a few years ago. He said certain moments of our history we were trying to freeze frame, and when we freeze frame it at that moment, we don't take a deeper contextual look at it for what it is and how it has a global implication to it. So yeah, I agree with you 100% on that.
Absolutely. Baba Kimo, you want to say something?
Oh, I lost my train of thought. But anyway,
listen, I want to say first of all, I totally agree on that assessment of the massacre, what they call the massacre, but we know that they have been massacring us for decades and decades and decades leading up to that, and that there was literally an Orangeburg freedom movement. We had a whole movement that was known statewide, nationwide, that we were fighting to end white supremacy and destroy segregation right there in Orangeburg. That Orangeburg was one of the theaters of warfare, so to speak. So like what you said, what happened in Rhodesia, it mirrored what happened right there in Orangeburg, and people could see that we were dealing with the same white supremacy. We were dealing with the same segregation. That segregation and apartheid are the same. That, you know, the students over there that we support, we should be supporting our own students here as well who's engaged in that same struggle. And when we talk about civil rights or anything gained from that struggle, you cannot exclude the young people. All of that was pushed by the young people, the students, and a lot of them was led by people just like you, Dr. Greene, professors who were progressive and wasn't afraid to teach them the truth and arm them with the responsibility to change the world. And so it's a powerful thing when we look at Orangeburg and the fact that I say we've been buried alive. Our history has been buried alive, and this is the reason why our ancestors have been waking us out of our sleep. This is why they've been showing us all kinds of glimpses of themselves just in everyday life, because they want us to remember that Orangeburg has been buried alive. Just like the towns that you have that is underwater, the history of Orangeburg needs to be told. I feel like the history of South Carolina is untold without it. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why. You being from Augusta, we always talk here about the story of the Wanderers. And the Lamar family was from Augusta, the family that actually organized and coordinated the illegal importation of 410 Africans from the Congo as late as 1858 were from Augusta. And they sold over half of those wanderers into what was then Orangeburg district, which included Aiken and a whole lot of these areas. And so y'all gotta excuse the ring in the background, right? So so what I'm saying is that all of that is very, very important. It all feeds itself. Brother Dom, maybe you can chime in about some of the research that you've done to highlight, you know, the kind of torture, the kind of terrorism that we was going through in the early 1800s. You know, what we was running from during the Great Migration. Why was we getting out of there? You know, because this is all a testament of our story. If we suffered a collective genocide, but we can't talk about it because they buried the facts, then our responsibility, just like you said, Dom, all the time, we are researching a scene of the crime.
Yeah,
the crime scene that we're researching. When we do our genealogy, we find crime evidence.
Mm-hmm. Exactly right, because Orangeburg was, for one, Orangeburg is seen as one of the major battleground states in the civil rights movement. And even before then, we had like civil rights leaders who, you know, who served as pinnacles of the community. And then you know, we always talk one of the major reasons why people went up north to escape racial terrorism. Like they were being terrorized down this way, lynchings, massacres, burnings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you got leaders like B.F. Randolph kind of like helping to lead movements right after enslavement ended, like that's monumental. Because you remember I showed you the newspaper clipping from 1867, 69 when they had to call the militia down here before they even caught the militia for Charles Evans in Norway. And B.F. Randolph was right there, front and center, in the middle of all of that.
You know, I'm actually glad you mentioned Benjamin F. Randolph. I just really quick, I know we had talked about Mediska Simpkins earlier. Benjamin Randolph is a really interesting figure because he's one of the first prominent Black politicians in South Carolina during Reconstruction. And he's assassinated. You know, campaigning for the Republicans, and who he is after whom Randolph Cemetery in Columbia, South Carolina is named. You know, a cemetery that houses a lot of famous Black figures from the state of South Carolina. So again, Benjamin Randolph, who represented the Orangeburg area during Reconstruction, right off the bat, as soon as emancipation comes, you have political violence targeting Black folk from Orangeburg. And that is a continuing theme throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And, you know, again, today being May 31st, and June 1st, yesterday was the anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. You know, so again, all these things I think tie together, and we have to find ways to recognize that within our communities.
Yeah, we gotta. You shouldn't depend on the social structure to highlight that. We alone should highlight that. We should teach that to each other. That should be our responsibility.
You know, Orangeburg County and Orangeburg City are majority African American populations, and that's very much considerable, considering how the population is so watered down now. That Orangeburg County still maintains a majority Black population, and that the city is like 70%, I believe, like 70% Black American. And so those of us who are historians, we have our work cut out. It's time for us to work together, bring our notes together, develop local curriculums, local outreach programs. We can reach the babies. We can reach them 5 years old to 12 years old with a real program that can implant them with some history that connects them into being proud about being from Orangeburg, but to the broader history of Orangeburg's contribution to the world, to the United States. You know, I think it's very, very important. Some of the work that we're doing is we've been using genetic genealogy to understand the African heritage of Orangeburg. That African people were brought to Orangeburg, and then they begin to have generations of descendants. And that's who we are. We're the descendants of those Africans that were brought to Orangeburg, right? And we have to now narrate that story. We have to tell that story properly. Now that we have information, we have technology, we have the research, we have the scholarship, they are now removing Black history from curriculums all over America. It's a perfect opportunity for us to work between the communities and the universities and the colleges to do some educational programming. So I wanted to know from you, because we always have educators here. We've had one brother recently, Baba Amin, who's more of like an independent, African-centered educator. They're building institutional educational curriculums and alternatives for our people. How do you see the collaboration work between people like us? We're independent. We have an organization. We do our own little research. Then we have people like Baba Amin, who's doing whole institution building. And then yourself, as a professor from Claflin, how do we get these educational institutions working together to streamline a single consciousness for our people?
Now, that is a really, I think, important and critical question. And in some ways, we've done this work before. If you think about, say, Claflin and State during the Civil Rights era, and even before that, you have a lot of collaboration between, say, educators at those universities and people in the public. You know, there was not this idea that we have to have this fine wall between the university and the rest of the community. And I think that's actually to our detriment in the 21st century. But instead, I think what we're looking at now is that we have to have kind of an inside-outside model where you have outside the academy, outside of standard K-12 classes, we have to continue to enhance and strengthen programs and curriculum that educate our youth about Black history, history of Orangeburg, history of South Carolina. Places like the church or civic organizations, I think, are perfect for this, but just finding a way to do that, and then also encouraging greater collaboration between those kinds of groups and, say, academic historians like myself and others. I think one thing also to do with this is we got to encourage folks to go out and experience public programming on history. So if you're in Orangeburg or in Columbia or in South Carolina, if you have a chance to check out a program from Dr. Bobby Donaldson at the University of South Carolina, please do so. If you have a chance to check out programming from SC State by folks like Frank Martin, please do so. Or folks at Allen or Benedict, please do so. If you have a chance to visit the International African American Museum in Charleston, please do so. There are so many opportunities for folks to learn. But the thing is that we have to tie that learning to a holistic understanding of citizenship. Just mentioned a moment ago that Black history is under attack in a way it hasn't been in quite some time. And we have to recognize that we really just got Black history into mainstream American history in the last few decades or so. This is a very new thing, but we as a community have always embraced our own history. Now what we have to do is to not only defend that history where it is in schools and in universities and so forth, but we have to also make sure we never forget to promote this history in Black civic society, in churches, civic organizations, social groups, social clubs, that sort of thing. That's going to involve collaboration with academic historians, but I've always felt that the best way to keep history alive is to do so amongst the public itself. Academics by ourselves can't do it. We can help, we can produce books, articles, we can help with all these different things, but the public is going to have to really carry the mantle of saving Black history. In my opinion, though, I trust the Black public to do that precisely because we've been doing it for so long already.
Good answer. Good answer. And that's what this show is all about, because that's what we do. We invite people like you. We've had Frank Martin on the show. We've had Professor Fordham. That's what the Gullah House show is all about. Sharing these type of stories and trying to get it out to the public, not only here just in Orangeburg, but even where Chief is at in Sierra Leone. So that's what we're all about, man. That's why we invited you here, to help get the word out and to see how we can collaborate, work with each other.
Well, and I will add to that, really quickly, I am open to any sort of collaboration that you guys want to do. I'm often in Orangeburg during the academic year, and I live in Columbia all year round. Also, with the Majeska Simpkins School, we not only have the actual school, which runs from March through June. Every Monday night we meet and do classes, but we also have deeper dive sessions on Sunday afternoons that are open to the general public. They're open at the Grow Building in Columbia, which is actually right behind Majeska Simpkins' historic home, and are also available on Zoom. And in fact, our next Sunday session is coming up this coming Sunday. It is going to be about, appropriately enough, the Orangeburg Massacre. So we really encourage folks to come out to that. It'll start at 4 o'clock this Sunday, June 8th. We'll be showing the film Scarred Justice and having a conversation afterward. But that's both in person and via Zoom as well.
Wow, that's great. You told us earlier
Yeah, I'm gonna try to attend that.
About a book you just reviewed. Can you tell us a little bit about that? The John Lewis.
Sure. So one of my favorite activities or / obligations as a historian to do is to write book reviews of various books of history. And I just finished reading the new David Greenberg biography called John Lewis, A Life. And I wrote it for the Society of U.S. Intellectual Historians. I've been a member since 2013 or so. I've been publications chair the last few years. I'm finishing up that job this summer. But the book is a rich work, a biography about John Lewis. And I would encourage folks to read it. Even if you think you know everything about John Lewis, there are things in the book that will probably surprise you. I'll give you a couple of examples. For one, the book is richly detailed. So there's no stone left unturned in John Lewis's life. There's a brief story in the book about when Lewis was a college student in Nashville in the early 60s, where he actually meets W.E.B. Du Bois. And I never read this story before, but apparently Du Bois, before he left America for Ghana, he was on campus just talking to students, and Lewis briefly meets him. And Lewis talked about how that was a big moment in his life. But also the book gets into great detail about what Lewis did after his time with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee finished up in 1966. How we all know he ran for Congress eventually, but before that, he was part of the Voter Education Project. He worked in the Jimmy Carter White House. Of course, he becomes part of Atlanta City Council, then runs for Congress. But the book offers a lot of great detail about John Lewis's life. And I think even whether you know about Lewis or not, it is an important book to read, if for no other reason than it gives real context and scope to what folks were doing during the civil rights movement. Because you think about how John Lewis gets this massive biography, and I hope it encourages folks to say, write a biography of Majeska Simpkins, for example, who I think deserves her own book-length biography as well. But John Lewis, A Life, it's a rich texture biography. I will highly recommend it to folks who are interested in the civil rights movement, in Mr. Lewis himself, or just interested in the Black experience in America.
I got one other thing for you, Professor, before we go, the time we got left. I know that you have been picked as one of the 12 leaders in South Carolina. I think I saw that on the Post and Courier. Tell me about because I thought that was cool. One of the up and new coming leaders.
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, so the Post and Courier since 2021 has done an annual listing of 12 Black leaders in South Carolina, and I was humbled to be part of the initial cohort in 2021. In fact, I have joked with friends of mine, and that's the one thing I have in common with Dawn Staley, because she's also part of that list as well. But it was actually pretty nice because they picked me because they recognized my work as a historian and as an educator here in South Carolina. And I like talking about the fact that I was one of those 12 Black leaders to know, not for my own personal aggrandizement, but to really let folks know that there are a lot of Black folk in this state doing some great work. Right. If you check out the list and you see my name on it, that's great. I'm humbled. I'm happy you see my name. You read the little essay about me that mentions my love of Star Trek
Right.
and other things. But I would encourage folks to seek out those lists because there are a lot of Black people in the state doing work. And I mentioned that because, to go back to your earlier point about the Great Migration, when I talk to my students at Claflin now, every semester at some point I ask them, okay, when you guys are done at Claflin, how many of you plan on leaving South Carolina? Not just Orangeburg, but the state in general. And the vast majority say yes. I firmly believe that there is a rich reservoir of Black talent in South Carolina. So much of it leaves for what folks would think of as being greener pastures, whether it's in North Carolina or Georgia or up north or out west. And you think about how much has been achieved in this state with the people who stayed behind, like a Majeska Simpkins or a Robert Smalls or a
Esau
Fatima Clark,
Jenkins.
Esau Jenkins, and James Felder, and so many others. And it's really an incredible story, right? I still maintain that the story of Black America is incomplete without the story of Black South Carolina. And that story is incomplete without the story of Orangeburg. So I think all of us have a responsibility and an obligation to do what we can to make these stories as well known as possible. But the good news is that whenever I talk to folks about history, I can tell there is a genuine hunger amongst the general public to learn more of this history. It's just up to us to help them gain the tools to learn that history.
That's
right. That's right.
That's another pet peeve of mine. That I would like to see more of Claflin students and state students. You know, they leave. I mean, I don't blame them. I mean, my mother did the same thing. My aunts and uncles did the same thing. But you just hate to see all that talent go away, because Orangeburg has a lot of potential, and it really does. It really does. It just, for whatever reason, people want to seek greener pastures, but you can make greener pastures here. You know, you can
exactly right.
You know, you can do it right here.
Exactly.
But so, what else the future holds for you, Professor?
Well, a couple of things. I am the co-host of a podcast called Our New South. We just finished our second season. We're hoping to get a third. We're an award-winning podcast. I co-host I co-host with Kevin Blackistone, who, if you watch sports or ESPN, you might know who he is. He's a journalist for the Washington Post, a professor of journalism at the University of Maryland. In the last couple of years, we've done this podcast together on behalf of the Levine Museum of the New South out of Charlotte, North Carolina. It's been a blast to work on. We're hoping to get a third season. Right now, I'm trying to also finish my book on the relationship between Black Americans and the Democratic Party since the passage of 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act. That was my dissertation at USC, and now I'm turning it into a book for University of Pennsylvania Press. I'm still trying to finish up the manuscript now, and I hope that's out, relatively soon. But I've got a lot of projects that involve, in some ways, the history of Black South Carolina, the history of Black folk in Orangeburg. At Claflin, I do also give a historic campus tour of the campus that's less about what the campus is today and more about the legacy of the campus and its history as an institution of higher learning.
Wow.
And so, I really think of my mission as one of encouraging folks to really learn and value and cherish Black history, because if we don't do that for ourselves, no one else will do it for us.
Exactly right. And I want to also, man, congratulate you being included on that list, because that just coincides with what I believe. Whereas, you honor past leaders, you recognize the ones of the day, and you prepare for the ones of tomorrow.
Absolutely. Totally agree with you 100% on that.
Well, it's been a great show, sir. I enjoyed having you on here and everything, man. I think I want to come up on Claflin and shake your hand one day.
Well, I would love to do that. And I think offline, we should all talk together about things we can do collaboratively to help really spread Black history.
100%. Yes.
For sure. We would love that. I'm here. I'm available. I have time to, we have time to talk and do some things. Yes, that would be incredible.
That's anything that you research information-wise, we can contribute, and I'll gladly help out. No issues.
Well, that sounds great. Thank you so much.
Well, I think we lost Chief. So, like I say, it's been great having you on, man, and I enjoyed it. And
well, thank you. I was happy to be on this morning and really enjoyed it as well.
You got something else to say, Chief?
No, I'm here, man. It's just real loud. This rain is beating real loud over here. But yeah, no doubt. I want to know if you could address this question here from our viewer. It said, are the African American special collections of Claflin and South Carolina State Library still intact? As a junior at OW, I spent many, many hours studying a plethora of great authors and scholars.
Yes, some of that is much of that is still available at Claflin State. The librarians at both universities are more than happy to help folks access those collections and to help them, kind of comb through them. But yeah, we certainly have a lot of, special collections at both Claflin and State. Some of it's freely available. Some of it you got to talk to our librarians to get special access to. But yes, we have some special stuff on both of our campuses people can still access and research from.
No, okay. Yeah, I would like to do that. I would like to come up on the campus and, research a little bit.
Yeah, I'm definitely coming on up there. I got some stuff I need to look into.
No, definitely.
Yeah, we got to stay connected offline. Let's see what we can do to try to bridge this gap and bring the resources to the educational community. Because really, if we want our people to learn, then we have to invest in the teachers. We have to make sure that the people who's responsible for educating have the resources needed to educate.
Exactly.
And the only way we can have that is if we collectivize it, because no individual has it all. The universities have served black people very, very well in Orangeburg. We should big up both of the universities in Orangeburg that have been giving our people this opportunity to learn. It's such a powerful thing. And when you think about history spiritually, it's like, wow. If you put God in the middle of it, it's like, whoa. Because our people have always kept their faith first. Regardless of what we believe in, they believe in God.
Right.
And they have faith in that. And they believe that their prayers are going to be answered. And look at us. And so we can attribute it to God. We can attribute it to what we want to. But I say to our ancestors for answering to the inner voice of their own conscience and pursuing education. It's a very, very powerful story that we have. And I'm looking forward to seeing how we can collaborate between the Gullah Nation of North America. We have a great responsibility. We took on the role of educating people in the world about Orangeburg's Gullah Geechee heritage. This is an aspect of South Carolina history and heritage that typically has been told wrong or has been minimized only to a certain region. But we've blown that thing off, blown it out the water, man. Just by chasing our own genealogy, just by identifying our own ancestors who migrated from the Low Country, who were owned by slave masters who migrated from the Low Country. It's like, here go the connection of the culture being transferred from the coastal region to the inlands. The same rice that was being grown in Georgetown was being grown in Orangeburg. The same rice.
Exactly right.
And so we're also trying to make those cultural heritage connections within that can help us get our identity intact. I think once we realize that we're Africans, and no matter what composition of that we are, that Black history is the continuation of African history in the United States of America. And so it's powerful. Thanks for the dialogue. I appreciate you, brother, for accepting the invite. Dom, you never miss, Dom. You never miss.
Happy to serve, brother.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, man. Bye-bye, Chemo. We got to go over to Claflin, man.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's about 10 minutes away from my house, man. So I'll be up there.
Yeah, go talk to the students, man. Go let them know about the Orangeburg Gullah Geechee heritage.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Let them know about it. That's a great educational experience. It don't just have to happen at festivals. Just go up in them schools, man. Talk to them. But salute. Thank you everybody out there for paying attention today. We're about to close out, but do you have any last words, Doc? Any last words before we go?
Well, all I will simply say is I want to encourage folks to remember that Black history is not just in February, but it's a year-round experience. And to seek out Black history from not just academics and historians who've been professionally trained, but to seek it out from people in the community. Because again, we are the ones who are going to have to keep this history alive for generations to come.
Well said, sir.
Spoken like a true griot.
That's right. Chemo, anything, Chemo?
Well, I mean, he said it all. Another great episode. I enjoyed it. Thank you for coming on the Gullah House Show, Professor. And
yeah, man.
We'll see you soon.
Hey, listen, man. I'm looking at Professor Greene. I'm thinking about Professor Fordham. I'm thinking about Dr. Curry. I'm thinking about the kind of educational conferences and events that we really can put together with these real, powerful brains that we have. So I'm looking forward. Thank you, brother, so much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
all right, everybody, enjoy your afternoon.
All right, brother. We'll be in contact with you. All right, y'all. So there you go. Another banger. Shout out to Dom. Shout out to our Professor Robert Greene. Hey, Orangeburg, we love y'all. Delegates, we love y'all. Black African world, we love y'all. And hey, Dom, be safe on the road and enjoy yourself down there
All
in
right,
Orlando,
bro.
brother.
All right, y'all be easy up that way, and you be easy in Sierra Leone, man.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, bye-bye, Kimo. You too, man. We'll holler at y'all later.
All right.